Hello, on behalf of the International Federation on Aging, I would like to welcome you to the second webinar in the IFA post-conference webinar series. This webinar will discuss topics related to ageism and employment and will be presented by Gemma Mooland, Senior Innovation Manager at Centre for Aging Better, UK. After Gemma's presentation, there will be a question and answer period, and attendees are encouraged to submit questions by typing them in the question section throughout the webinar. Now I'm going to pass it over to Gemma to begin her presentation.
Hi everyone, this is Gemma here from the Centre for Aging Better, and thank you Hannah for the introduction. So I'm here today to talk to you about how we can combat ageism to improve access to employment. So in this presentation I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of why fulfilling work and being in fulfilling work really matters for people to lead a good later life. I'm then going to share with you some of the statistics and what we know about ageism in the workplace, and also talk to you a little bit about the experiences of people in later life when they're in work. And then I'll finish off with some insights and some practical advice that we've developed at the Centre for Aging Better around how, as employers, we can become more age-friendly. So firstly, just to say a little bit about who we are at Centre for Aging Better, for those who aren't familiar. We are an independent charitable foundation. We were set up back in 2015, so we're still quite young, and we were funded with an endowment from what is now known as the National Community Lottery Fund. But our purpose as an organisation is to help create a society where everyone can enjoy a good later life. And so as an organisation, we work across a range of different issues, one of which is around supporting people to live well in their homes for longer, looking at how we can develop more connected communities, looking at how we can enter our later life in good health, and a really important part of our work is about how we can support more people to be in fulfilling work and as they approach their later life. As an organisation, we're part of what is known as the What Works network over here in the UK, which is a network of organisations that are all about promoting the better use of evidence in practice and in policy. And so we develop, share and apply evidence around what works in helping people to lead a good later life. And then really importantly, we work with others to then use that evidence to bring about change. So in the context of our work around employment and worklessness and unemployment, we do a lot of work with employers and umbrella bodies and support services who work here in the UK to help them use our evidence to change their ways of working. So just to start off, why good work matters for later life and why this is something that's really, really important if we want to be thinking about how, as a society, we can be better prepared for our longer lives. At the Centre for Aging Better, we know that there's three things that are really important for people to lead a good later life. One of those is having good enough health. Another is to have good enough financial security, and also to have those social connections and this broader sense of meaning and purpose that is associated with that. And work interrelates with all of these different factors. It's not so much that working longer makes you more healthy. The evidence is a bit conflicted on that, but we do know that if you're in better health, you are able to work for longer. And we also know that if you're out of work, and if you're out of work involuntarily in particular, that can be actually quite bad for your health. So unemployment is associated with lower health and well-being. So work and health are closely interrelated, and work is important for your health. Work is obviously very important for your financial security, both in the immediate term in terms of extending that period of earning, which also allows you to then save more and delay your drawdown on your pension. So it's really important for that financial security in those years that you're no longer in work for. And work is a really important source of social connections and that sense of meaning and purpose. But whilst work is really important for all these things, it's not just a matter of any old work will do. all of those positive benefits of being in work are dependent on the quality of work. And that's why we talk about supporting people in later life to be in fulfilling work, because bad quality work that's either insecure or low paid can actually be quite damaging for your health and then won't have those same positive outcomes in terms of financial security and social connections. So we're really focused on thinking about how we can improve the quality of work and ensure that more people in later life are able to access that sort of work. And it's not just us that says that we think working in later life is a good thing. This is something that people tell us time and time again is really important in their lives. People want to be able to work for longer. And that's shown actually when you ask people this question. So when you ask people what do they miss most about work once they've stopped working, I mean, fair enough, lots of people, a big group of people say they don't miss anything, but actually the majority say that they do. And I think what's really interesting here in this graph is that shows us that it's not actually even the practical elements, sort of financial side of work that people really miss. It's that social interaction. So believe it or not, it's the people that are sat around you today, right now, are the people that you may well miss the most when you retire. So whilst working in later life and up until your retirement age is something that's really, really important for people, it's not without its challenges. And from midlife, you are more likely to be a carer, to have one or more health conditions, to say you feel insecure at work, to face redundancy, to be stuck and stay stuck in low pay. And you are less likely to be offered or to ask for training, to be promoted or to progress at work, or to be able to re-enter the workplace if you leave. So there's a whole host of challenges that we need to address, and I'm going to take you through some of these in some more detail in the remainder of this presentation. But just on the particular topic of ageism, as that's the sort of focus of our discussion today, I just wanted to share with you a few interesting statistics. The big caveat here is that obviously we've got an international audience with us today, which is fantastic, and perceptions of older people and older workers do vary globally. So where you are in the world will impact the overarching perception of older workers. Interesting here in terms of showing the proportions of people who think that having older workers is a disadvantage, is kind of neutral, doesn't have an impact, or it just keeps things the same. I think it's even interesting here that this graph doesn't pick up the numbers of people who think it's an advantage, which in and of itself is quite telling. But you can see that there are some variations globally around how we perceive older workers. But one thing that we do tend to agree in general about older people is that we lack respect, and that seems to be something that is a quite commonly held perception in terms of our attitudes to older people within our society. So there's a little bit of variation, which is, I guess, the caveat to what I'm about to present. So the rest of the statistics that I'm just going to share with you do relate to the UK, but there will be general themes that I think we can draw out across different areas across the globe. So what is really interesting is that within the UK we have the Equality Act, which outlines several different protected characteristics. And it is ageism, it is age, of all those characteristics that people say that they experience the most. So admittedly, a lot of that is sort of sometimes or rarely, but you can really see that people say much more so than any of the other protected characteristics that it's their age that they experience some form of prejudice or discrimination around. But of all the protected characteristics, it's the kind of discrimination that people tend to think is slightly less serious. So even though lots of people are saying that they may have experienced some sort of prejudice, generally we're perceiving that ageism isn't actually as serious as perhaps some of the other forms of discrimination, which is quite an interesting presentation. And what's even more interesting is that when you ask people whether their preconceptions and their predispositions towards people with different protected characteristics, we tend to quite like people in later life. So it seems to be quite a pervasive form of discrimination, but something we don't tend to feel is that serious. And quite often we say it's almost in a positive way, an attitude towards older people. But I think this is really interesting, and this is a study that was done a few years ago, which found that whilst we tend to have quite positive views of older people in terms of them being very friendly and approachable, they also tend to be rated as perhaps the less capable. So friendly but not that competent is a phrase that kind of gets heard a few times, and it's come up in a few other surveys since then. And so that's just quite an interesting presentation of sort of, I guess, where societal attitudes may lay at the moment. And you can imagine some of the challenges that causes when you think about attitudes, particularly within the workplace. So that gives you a sense of sort of where the current lay of the land is in terms of general attitudes towards people in later life. But how does that age bias actually affect people in the workplace? Well, there's several different areas and parts of work in which those issues manifest. So one of them, as you would very much imagine, does arise when it comes to recruitment. And people in later life, or people over the age of 50, tend to experience a range of different challenges. So over a quarter say that they have been put off a job since they turned 50, as they think that job sounds like it's aimed at a younger candidate. I'm sure we've all seen job adverts that describe they're looking for kind of enthusiastic, new starters, energetic. Those sorts of words can actually be quite loaded in terms of the age bias that sits behind them. Quite concerningly, almost a third believe that they have been turned down for a job because of their age, and nearly 1 in 5 have subsequently considered hiding their age when applying for a job since turning 50, as they feel like that would be a disadvantage for them, and that's true for 2/5 of this population. So people are actually actively changing their practices and attitudes and their approaches when applying for jobs, because they feel like their age is acting against them. I think it's worth also flagging at this point that it is very difficult to really clearly and robustly measure the prevalence of age discrimination. So lots of the statistics that we report are around people's perceptions. And that's quite interesting because one of all the protected characteristics that we have here in the UK and the different grounds on which you could potentially sue your employer for being discriminatory, age is the one that has the fewest cases brought up against it. And those that are brought up actually very rarely make it through to tribunal. So we really lack good quality data on the prevalence of this. But it is something and a perception that is very strong, and as I'll explain later, has a real impact on people's behaviours within the workplace. So recruitment is one of those really important areas where people experience challenges. Another one is in relation to management and how people interact with their manager as they enter later life. Quite interesting quote here where they feel that you might be questioned on whether you're committed enough or whether you're capable, whether you have the right kind of energy. Those sorts of, again, quite prejudicial statements are brought up in the workplace as people move into later life. And subsequently, only 1 in 4 feel that they can actually openly talk with their manager about their future career plans, and only 1 in 5 about their retirement. So we feel like we're not able to have those same sorts of conversations about our training, about our progression, about our future ambitions when we hit later life. I feel even more uncomfortable doing that in the context of our retirement. So there's something that we need to be doing about normalising these conversations at all stages in the life course. Only 1 in 5 also feel that they can talk to their manager about adjusting their current role to suit their needs. So in the UK, we have a right to request flexible working once you've been in a job for 26 weeks. But despite that right, people still feel like they're not able to have that conversation. And perhaps going back to some of those concerns that people have about how they'll be perceived around their capability or commitment if they're having those sorts of conversations. And 16% think they have been managed differently or unfairly compared to younger workers. So some sense of an intergenerational conflict within the workplace or perception of that, which absolutely doesn't have to be the case, but some people are starting to feel that that's happening in their workplaces. There's a really interesting then set of challenges around people feeling valued and respected, and going back to that idea of equal opportunities. 1 in 3 people over the age of 50 feel that they've had fewer opportunities for training and progression as they've gotten older, so they feel that they've been offered fewer opportunities. I think what's also interesting there is seeing the other side of the story, and we do know that as people age, and actually it's from sort of 20 and onwards, that your likelihood of wanting training at work and also your likelihood of expecting it also declines. So there's a sort of interacting set of attitudes and perceptions between the employer and employees that are quite interesting to address. 9% feel they've been overlooked for an internal role or a job promotion. Worryingly, 11% say they've kind of been the butt of the joke from colleagues as a result of their age. And whilst we might over here call that banter, I guess that's not going to always be perceived the same by different people. And we need to be as careful as we are with other characteristics as we are with age when we're thinking about these sorts of issues. 1 in 5 people at work think people see them as less capable as they get older, which you can imagine is quite an unpleasant experience when actually over the many years you've acquired huge amounts of skills and experience that should be valued within the workplace. And then a really sad statistic is that nearly a third think that workplaces don't value older workers as much as others. Now, people also do experience these issues around ageism when they're out of the workplace. So whilst lots of people are in work in later life, over here in the UK, we know that currently there's 3.6 million people between the age of 50 and 64 who are not in work. And approximately 1 million of those would like to be working but are not. And we know that these individuals face a whole host of different barriers in getting back into work, and they are the least likely of all the different age groups, gender groups, ethnic groups, of all different groups of characteristics. It's people over the age of 50 who are the least likely to actually get back into work. And lots of the issues that people experience in trying to get back into the workplace do come back to issues around ageism. So perceived ageism in employer attitudes, particularly when it comes to recruitment, they feel that they are a less desirable candidate. Actual ageism in the sort of way in which recruitment processes are run, so they're often online. They're often very, very different to the recruitment processes that people may have experienced 20 years ago when they got their previous job that they were in. And so the processes that people have to go through themselves can actually act against people in later life. For example, requiring a degree as a precondition for being able to apply for a job. Lots of people over the age of 50 might not have that particular qualification, but all the skills and experience that is needed for the job. So, little things within processes can actually immediately exclude people in later life from applying for certain jobs. And also even ageism in some ways in the services that people access. So we have people saying that the skills support that was available for unemployed people in the UK felt like it was geared towards younger people. It was all based in colleges or in schools. And people saying, I don't feel like that's the right place for me to go. I don't feel like it's something that's designed for someone like me. So a whole host of challenges there. And one of the really interesting and very concerning things that happens as a result of that is that we see that this population started to sort of internalise this ageism and started to see themselves as too old to be working. I met a man who was just 47 years old and had classed himself as retired and had given up on work and said, work is no longer for me anymore because of all these barriers that he's faced. So that internalised ageism, I think, is a really interesting and important dynamic to address as well. However, there is plenty that we can do to improve this situation and lots of ways in which we can support people to get back into work by improving our age-friendly employment practices and helping those who are already in work to stay in work. And it's not, absolutely massively different from lots of the stuff that a good employer would already want, because when you ask older workers what it is that they want and what it is that they need, it is pretty much the same as everybody else. Older workers want meaning, autonomy, control and recognition. They want social contact with colleagues and customers and clients of all ages. They want equal opportunities for progression and development, flexibility in where and how, and as well as when they work, and support to manage their health at work effectively. And that is the same as anyone else at work. So we're not talking about massive, massive changes that are needed here, but we do need to be really consistent and really thoughtful in how these changes are brought about. So at the Centre for Ageing Better, we recently produced a guide on becoming an age-friendly employer, which is available up on our website. And that outlines 5 key areas where we think work needs to change in order to be more age inclusive. So I'll just take you through each of these 5 points now. So the first one is about being flexible, about flexible working. So we know that flexible working is really, really important for people to stay in work, but also to access work, particularly for people who either have a caring responsibility, and we know that your 50s and your 60s are that prime age for caring, and it's also really important for people who have a health condition, and being able to be a bit more flexible with your work can really help people to sort of balance the challenges of their health and work and to stay in work for longer. So flexible hiring is absolutely essential. You know, advertise those jobs at the point of recruitment as flexible, and you will get all sorts of different people feeling able to apply for that job. Also, widen the range of flexible working options that you have available. It doesn't always have to be these very formal procedures and very formal arrangements. That sort of informal flexibility that's managed on a one-to-one basis can be really, really important for people, just in helping them to overcome the occasional issue or barrier that they might experience. I think it's really important that you don't also just have a flexible working policy and it sits on your intranet and then you think that's job done. It's really important that we help people to navigate the system. We know that there are employers who have a very good flexible working policies, but old workers don't always feel able to access those policies. They might be concerned about any repercussions in doing that as a result of some of those challenges and those perceptions I've just outlined for you. So being really proactive in helping your employees to navigate the system, we think is a really important part of making sure that flexibility is a reality for everyone in the workplace. Secondly, the real importance of hiring age positively. Conducting much more age-positive recruitment campaigns is something that we really want to push. I don't know about you, but the number of times I see an advert with people on it who are somewhere in their 20s or 30s compared to someone who's slightly older, I see far more of the former than the latter. So much more age inclusive in our recruitment campaigns, in our marketing materials, and in the ways in which we even write our job descriptions and we frame those recruitment processes, and taking out those words around new starters or fresh or energetic that can be quite loaded terms, even if not intentionally. Being really careful and really conscious in our recruitment processes to help minimise any opportunities for age bias. And also, it's worth thinking about actually developing specific programs, particularly for those people who may have left work because of a caring responsibility or a health condition and they're now looking to re-enter the work. Thinking about how we can develop specific programs to support those people in that transition. Thirdly, a really important one, which is ensuring that everyone has the health support that they need at work. We did some research last year which shows that people in later life are less likely to access the kind of health support that they need at work, and that they face a whole range of challenges and concerns in raising conversations around their health at work. People were saying things like it often feels like you're setting up yourself on a sort of downward hill of decline. If you're sort of starting to raise your health conditions, your employers start to write you off. And issues like that, again, that perception of employer attitudes really impacted the degree to which people feel able to have the conversations that they need with their managers. And so one of the things that's really important is just creating a much more open and supportive culture around managing health at work. The number of older workers is increasing day by day, and the number of people within the workplace that have a health condition at all ages is going to increase. And so we just need to be generally much better and much more positive about enabling those conversations to be had. We also need to make sure that those conversations translate into some action, and so ensuring full, equal and early access to support is really, really important. So don't leave it too late, don't make processes so long that things go on for far too long and actually make the situation worse for that employee. And also just be open to the smallest and most simple of changes. We were talking to people who were saying, I just wanted a fan, or I just needed to sit near the window, or a headset would have made all the difference to me. But they have to go through very long internal procedures to get those sorts of changes. And finally, particularly when we're talking about people in later life who are more likely than other groups to have a long-term health condition, it's really important that the support that people receive at work is equally long-term and is sustained over time. Often we find that someone would say, oh yes, then we managed to adjust it so I could take 2 coffee breaks in the day just to give me the space I needed, but then 3 months down the line that adjustment had stopped. So making sure that the support we provide is sustained is really important. Going back to that point I raised earlier around encouraging and supporting career development at all ages is really, really important. Again, it's a matter of having those conversations with people. Make sure that training and progression is a conversation that you're having with employees, no matter what age they are. And in the UK at the moment, we've been looking at the idea of a midlife MOT, so a conversation that you have with your employer when you hit midlife to talk about your career plans, your retirement plans, how you're feeling in terms of your prospects of working for longer, how you're feeling in terms of your finances and what you need to save for your retirement. Really building in those moments into our working lives to enable us to have those conversations. And I think it's really, really important to help people feel that they have an opportunity to also plan and look ahead and really think about what they need from their working life to help them lead a good life after work. Those sorts of conversations we need to be much better at making more and more normal within the workplace. And finally, now this one can feel like the woolliest, but in some ways the most important. It's about just having a much more age-positive culture. We've done some fantastic things around gender and ethnicity and disability within the workplace, but we haven't been quite so deliberate and conscious around age yet. And there are lots of ways in which we could do that. Monitoring and sharing workforce data by age could be one of those. We've recently over here had publications of the gender pay gap, and that's resulted in all sorts of brilliant action. Do we have to be more public and conscious around our age diversity? And that will also help us as businesses plan better for our future and understand what parts of our workforce are aging or where people are perhaps moving out of work earlier than others, and do we need to change the way of working in that particular part of the business? If so, we also need to build in actual training for line managers so that they're equipped with the knowledge and skills to manage age-friendly practices. Sometimes it's as simple as just reminding people that they need to think about this as a potential support need for some of their older workers, but absolutely not all. And so I think that it's really important that we just start to have these conversations in the workplace. And finally, encourage and support interaction amongst staff of all ages, because people of all ages really enjoy that interaction with one another. And there's huge amounts that could be gained from different mentoring, reverse mentoring between different levels, sharing the kind of insight and wisdom that people who have been in the workplace for longer with younger workers, and all sorts of ways in which we can really make the most of that diversity within our workforce. If we build those opportunities in. So I'm close to finishing up and ready to take on all your questions, but just in summary, we are all living longer and working longer as a whole, of course, not to forget the huge inequalities that we have in later life. But overall, more people than ever before are working into their late 50s, 60s, and even 70s. And the number of older workers is continuing to grow. So when we're talking about our older workforce, we're not talking about something that's coming, we're talking about something that's already here. And work needs to catch up. Work and our employment practices need to be better so that working longer is also working better. And work should be a positive thing that helps us to maintain our health and prepare for a good later life. So I'm just going to leave these up in the background, which are the summary of those 5 actions to being an age-friendly employer. But that is all from me. So now I think back over to Hannah to help facilitate some of the questions and answers.
Thank you so much, Gemma, for that presentation. It was great to learn more about the ways that ageism impacts employment, as well as these 5 actions to make your employment a bit more age-friendly. So we have lots of questions, and I'm just going to get started. And one of the first ones was, does the type of job or profession make a difference with respect to how and when ageism is manifested?
Really good question. And yeah, there's been some analysis and lots of different analysis, and there's different ways in which that can come out. But certainly, if you look at sort of the average age of labour market exit, it definitely depends on the sorts of job you're in. So people who are in more manual jobs, for example, you tend to see that the age of exit can be slightly earlier, as people may struggle to stay in those jobs for longer. But it sort of is never really that straightforward, because it also depends on the level of work at which you're at. So managers or kind of lower skilled jobs, managers may tend to be able to stay in work for longer than those in lower skilled jobs. But equally, you do find people who are in lower skilled jobs actually staying in work for longer because of the financial necessity to work for longer. So I think we definitely see different experiences, both in sector and type of job, but also the reasons for people either leaving the workplace or staying in it does also vary, depending on whether it's because they need to or because they want to. So it's quite a complex picture.
Okay, great. And kind of along a similar vein of the research that's available, did any of the research you presented today look at the correlation between the mental health of the individuals who were experiencing discrimination and how this not only affected employment, but their physical well-being?
That isn't something that I am aware of. I will take a note of it to see if there is anything. But I think one of the things that, and it brings me back to a point that I raised earlier, which is that this is very difficult to measure and very difficult to evidence, because it is largely based on perception. And it is something that people experience in different points in time. Certainly in the work that we did and in the survey that we did, I don't think we measured any specific impact on the individual, but I will have a little look to see if there's anything out there more broadly on the impact of ageism on sort of mental health and well-being.
Okay. There's also a lot of questions related to returning to work. So I think related to that one slide where about 1 million people in the UK were currently unemployed but wish they were working. So do you have any recommendations as far, or more information regarding returnships for professional older workers who wish to be working, as well as those looking to get back in the job force more generally? So recommendations, applications, interviews, etc.
Yes. So what's actually really interesting is that for those who are out of work, we don't really know what works in supporting people to get back into work. There's just been a real lack of good evidence around what's really effective. But there are some really important principles that you can draw out from the work that we've done to date. So one of them is about making sure that the offer that you have is flexible. So the support that people can access, it needs to be flexible as much as the job itself at the end of it needs to be. So that people can manage either a training program or a skills course, and they can juggle that with if they've got a health condition or they've got a caring responsibility. So the offer and support offer that you have needs to be flexible. We know that in-work training is particularly effective. So rather than sort of classroom-based training, actually giving people the opportunity to do a trial of that job in the workplace, sort of hands-on, is a really, really positive way of enabling people to get back into work. But that on its own won't be enough. It's really important that you provide integrated support, because often these individuals are facing lots and lots of different barriers. It's not just that ageism in the recruitment process. It's often that they have got a health condition that's holding them back in some way, or they've got a caring responsibility that they need a bit of a help with, or that actually their current finances have meant that transport's a real issue. So you need blended models of support which cover the health issues, that provide information, advice and guidance around caring, that cover the training and skills and maybe some more of the practical elements, and bring that all together in a really sort of person-centered and holistic way. So those are some of the kind of really important principles that you need to have in any of those programs to support people to get back into work.
Okay. And I think, kind of building on that, when someone wants to raise the issue of ageism in employment, both at kind of the societal institutional level, but then maybe within their own career, do you have recommendations, or does the Center for Aging Better have any recommendations or kind of incidents when employers have reacted either positively or negatively to this idea of ageism within their job?
So I think in terms of sort of employer attitudes, one of the things that's interesting is that there's lots of employers would say that this isn't something that they're consciously doing. So I do think there's a bit of a making sure that employers in the first instance are aware that firstly age is a protected characteristic, and secondly how age bias might manifest in their processes or ways of working, because they might not even realise that they're doing it at all. And many employers are starting to see the hugely positive effects of supporting our older workforce and recognising that indeed it's an absolute necessity. In terms of advice to individuals, so as an organisation we don't offer sort of direct advice and guidance to people in later life. We're much more about sort of looking at how the systems and services in our society need to change. But it is always worth sort of seeking advice from an independent party. And there's lots within the UK, there's several organisations such as ACAS which might help you to do that. But also knowing your rights, I think, is really important, and knowing that age is a protected characteristic and that you can't be discriminated on as a result of your age unless there's some very extreme justifications for it. So it's always worth sort of people knowing that it's not okay and that they don't have to accept it as a given. But yes, always worth seeking that advice from an expert in this area.
Okay, great to know. Another, I think, employer-related question. Is there research that shows that employers are concerned about the health costs of older workers? And if so, is this something that's impacting their hiring practices?
There's a whole heap of perceptions that people have of people in later life, and one of them is that they take more sickness. They have higher rates of sickness absence, which is not shown to be true at all, particularly when it comes to short-term sickness absence. People in later life are not more likely to be taking lots of days of off work than others. So that certainly plays a part in employers' concerns. Along with a heap of other things, there's this thing called the lump of labour fallacy, which is the idea that if you have more older workers, there's less jobs for younger workers, which is not true because our labour markets are elastic and they're not static. So it doesn't mean that you're preventing newer recruits from coming through. And also the concerns about whether, older workers are as productive at work. And again, we know that is not true, that older workers are very productive, and that especially once they're supported effectively, and if particularly with issues around their health are well supported, then they're able to work as well as younger workers, and actually also bring a whole heap of benefits with them, particularly that experience and that skills and that wisdom of being in the workplace. Evidence shows that they tend to be better at resolving things like interpersonal conflicts, which probably comes from those extra years of having to deal with difficult situations in the workplace. So yes, definitely health is part of the set of concerns that employers have, and the evidence doesn't back them up so much.
Okay. Towards the beginning of the presentation, there was a question that asked, should older age be classified as a disability for employment purposes if society asks for special consideration? Thought you could maybe elaborate that related to both employment and ageism.
That's a really interesting point. I guess there's arguments on different sides of this one. One of the big things that we need to remember, and which is probably why this is such a challenge to address this issue as well, is that people in later life have very different experiences of later life. So not everyone in later life will experience a health condition, and not everyone in later life will experience a disability. So I think it's really important that we're careful to avoid any sort of sweeping generalizations or labels of people in later life. However, there are arguments around making sure that age, just in and of itself, is recognised as a particular sort of duty for employers to consider. Because we know that with disability, there's a right to make reasonable adjustments for an individual who has a disability. If we had that same sort of thing just for older workers, a right to make reasonable adjustments for older workers, then we know that that would hugely increase people's ability to access the sorts of support they need at work. So there's arguments for and against treating older workers as almost as a special category. But I do think we need to be careful that then that doesn't seep into the side of sort of thinking that everyone in later life is the same, because we know such a hugely diverse group.
Great. Thank you so much, Gemma, for that explanation. And thank you to everyone who submitted questions. Another quite prominent thread within what is being asked is how to deal with the costs related to becoming age-friendly and kind of workforce shift to artificial intelligence. So I don't know if, Gemma, you have any information regarding kind of the transitioning workforce type and how that impacts this as well, or just generally costs related to sustaining and creating age-friendly work environments.
The cost question is a complex one, but there is this. I guess there's a few points there. Firstly, we are all aging in the workplace, so everyone will eventually hit that point in time when they, at their own workplace, would benefit from the support that's required. And you can kind of see an invest to save sort of argument here, where if you make the kind of changes to the workplace that you need now, they'll benefit people right now, but also in the future for many years to come. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the example of BMW, who there was a particular plant where they had a higher proportion of older workers working on that plant, and they were really valued them because they had such specialist skills. But many were struggling to stay in work because of sort of the wear and tear of their bodies for being stood up for long periods of time. So they changed the workplace a lot, did lots of different things like getting these nice fancy rubber floors and various other bits and bobs to the workplace. And they actually saw an increase in productivity by 7% and made a return on that investment and beyond. So there are good case studies out there where actually employers can certainly in the long term, but sometimes even in the much shorter term, regain any of the costs from making those changes to the workplace. Also, lots of the things that we're talking about here don't actually cost money or that much money at all. It's more about just shifting the way in which we work and the culture of our workplaces to being more conscious and more careful about how we think about these issues. So I think that cost, yes, certainly shouldn't be a barrier to making any of these changes. In terms of that question around aging workforce and wider changes within the nature of the workplace, it's a really good one and one that you're hearing growingly. I think there's some interesting conversations, particularly around automation. And actually, some people see automation as a real threat to our future working lives and kind of getting rid of jobs. But actually, in some ways, it could be a huge opportunity for our aging workforce. So automated jobs are likely to take those more very manual, repetitive sorts of tasks. And those can be quite straining for people, particularly if they are those sort of more manual jobs. And actually, that would be able to free up other positions or free people from having to be in those positions to take on others that don't require that sort of more strenuous activity. Or automated activities can actually reduce some of the strain and burden from doing those jobs, but don't necessarily fully replace them. So there are ways in which technology and the changes in the workplace could actually really support people to be able to work for longer. So there's a whole heap, and there's some very interesting articles out there, but I don't think the evidence base is particularly strong about AI and recruitment and the role that plays in bias in recruitment processes. That's a whole other conversation, which the evidence isn't too strong on yet, but worth having a look at the articles out there on it, because I think that's a question that we will have to be thinking about really carefully in the near future, making sure that our AI isn't biased towards people in later life.
Okay. Building on that, there are a few questions about ageism within specific groups, especially. So those who have a disability on top of aging, perhaps different specific ethnic groups, and this is related to gender, ethnicity, and ageism in the UK, and then another one about dementia. So do you have any insight on how different groups are disproportionately affected by ageism within the workplace and employment practices generally?
Very, very good question. So yes, it is more often than not the case that people will experience a combination of bias. So yes, when you're a woman and older, or if an ethnic group and older, that intersectionality, I think, is the jazzy word that's used for it, is certainly something that people experience. But again, something that is really difficult to evidence. So when you bring a case to an employment tribunal in the UK, you can't bring it against two factors. So you can't say I've been discriminated on the basis of age and gender. You have to either bring two cases saying I've been discriminated on the basis of age and on the basis of gender and pursue them almost separately but in parallel, or you just pick the one that you think, I think effectively you think is easier to prove. And going back to this issue about often age bias being quite unconscious, something that people aren't particularly aware of themselves, that cases aren't reported against age that frequently. So it's a really tricky one. It certainly exists, but it's very difficult to evidence because of those issues in how kind of the employment law works, at least here in the UK.
Okay, and is there any kind of information on those who have sort of cognitive impairments or are starting to experience the impacts of cognitive decline? So whether it's actually fully re-entering the workforce or someone with dementia who wants to stay involved. There were a lot of questions on how to continue to be engaged in work-related activities if a person may not be able to do it all the time.
Yes, there's some really good advice out there for how you deal with dementia in the workplace. I think it's estimated that there's about 40,000 people under the age of 65 who have dementia. So, they're all and around 18% of them actually continue to work after a diagnosis. And it's certainly not the case that having dementia means that you can no longer work. But obviously, we do need to think about how our workplaces are improved to enable that. So that would be covered by a disability under the Equality Act, and that means that employers would have a requirement to make reasonable adjustments for staff with dementia. So that could be about having better signage or labelling or soundproofing or quiet spaces, whatever it may be. That will depend on the person and the individual person's needs. And I think that's, again, a really important point to remember across the piece here, is that any adjustments or support that's required in the workplace will depend on that individual person's circumstances. Everyone has different experiences. Whether they've got a positive and really involved support network outside of work will affect their ability to continue working in the workplace. So there's all sorts of different things to consider there, but there's some really good advice and guidance actually on the Alzheimer's Society. So I'd signpost you to that website if you're particularly interested in that, and they have a whole section on there about creating dementia-friendly workplaces.
That's great. And when we send out the slides and the webinar recording after this, we can include that link for those who are interested, as well as your Center for Aging Better publication on the 5 actions to be an age-friendly employer for future reference for everyone. And I think someone had a question related to your discussion on gender and ageism. An additional point was brought in around issues to do with sexuality. Does this impact in the same way where people would choose what to file their discrimination under, and it would just be whatever is easier to prove?
Again, I mean, that one I haven't got any sort of specific insights in relation to that. But yes, again, if someone felt that they had been discriminated on the basis of their sexuality and their age, they would either take both of those to the courts, or they would, yes, select the one that they felt was most provable, or the one that they felt had impacted them the most, or whatever it may be. But I don't have specific insights on that point of intersectionality.
Okay, and kind of switching gears a bit, this webinar has been focused on ageism, how it impacts older people in employment, but someone has asked about how ageism in employment can be directed towards younger people, millennials, and how that changes the dynamic in a workplace.
Yeah, a really good question. Obviously, as an organisation, we tend to focus on those who are sort of 50 and above. So it's not something that we've done direct work on as an organisation. But I do think that being more conscious about age means being more conscious about age, not older people. So when we're talking about age friendly, we're not saying older people friendly. We are talking about age as something that we're all experienced and will have different impacts on us throughout our life. And of course, there will be circumstances where, when you're younger, that disadvantages you. Again, I think that as few cases are brought up for younger people as they are for older people in terms of discrimination, if not even less. But I think the really important point about these 5 actions that you can see on the screen is that those benefit everyone. If you just take those as they are there, that is something that will benefit you no matter what age you are in the workplace. You know, flexible working is a really important thing for people of all ages, both in terms of practical needs, because we'll all have different needs for that throughout our life, but also just in terms of how we like to work. And so I think actually that these don't have to be principles that are specifically targeted at only benefiting older workers. Actually making our workplaces more age friendly benefits absolutely all of us at all ages, and not in the least, as I always say when we talk about these issues, is that we're all aging. So even if it's not particularly valuable for me right now that there's going to be midlife MOTs, I'm sure I'll be very thankful for it when I do get to the point of hitting 50. So, you know, I think that perception is really important to retain as well.
Okay, great. I'm going to end with one last question related to advocacy. Someone asked, what government policies should people be advocating for that improve the working conditions and ageism experienced by older people?
That's a really, really good question, and something that we've been thinking about internally. You know, the mechanisms are already there. The Equality Act exists. Age is a protected characteristic. So some of the things that we need to really be promoting is advocating the consistent application of those rights. And part of that means making and supporting people both to be aware of their rights, aware of the processes that are available to them, and supporting them to actually go through those processes. There are some small changes that we would suggest would be needed. So, for example, in the UK, employers don't have to have a conversation around flexible working until 26 weeks into your period of employment. But we would very strongly advocate for that right to flexible working being from day one. So that, because there's no point having that conversation 26 weeks down the line if you've got a health issue or a caring responsibility, you just won't be able to do that work for those 26 weeks. So, you know, advocating for bringing those rights forward, right to the point of hire, we think is really important. And also, you know, strengthening the rights of people like carers in the workplace, and ensuring that people who have been off either with a health condition or a caring responsibility actually have, you know, a right to return to work, and they aren't disabled from reaccessing work if they've had to take a period off work. So it's about strengthening and building upon, I think, a lot of the existing legislation and policies that are out there.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Gemma, for your presentation and answering all these questions. And thank you to everyone in the audience who hopefully learned a lot, as I did, and contributed to the question and answer period. The slides and the recording will be shared shortly after this for reference, as well as sharing to other individuals. And stay tuned for any announcements about future webinars in the series. Thank you so much.